You are listening to episode 38 of the Lewis and Kyle Show with Brandon Zhang.
If we're talking about mental wealth, we should probably not be using Twitter and Instagram and these very addictive social media platforms to get your attention, right?
Hello and welcome to the Lewis and Kyle Show. If you're new to our podcast, we're excited to have you. Lewis and I are students at the University of Alabama, and we're on a journey to deconstruct success stories of interesting entrepreneurs, investors, and people making a big impact on their world. Today, we share with you our interview with Brandon Zhang, an up-and-coming thinker who's blasted onto the Twitter scene, amassing over 8,000 Twitter followers in 2020. He's an apprentice to Jack Butcher at Visualize Value, who actually made the visuals for the Navalmanac, a book written by our last guest, Eric Jorgensen.
In this conversation, we talk about the role of mentors in Brandon's come up to the Twitter scene and how taking online courses from people like David Perell and Jack Butcher have accelerated his learning and progress. We also talk about how he's used Twitter as a way to make friends on the internet and connect with role models. And in general, we get into some of his tips and strategies and philosophy around building an audience. It's interesting how we found Brandon in the first place was because of a Twitter thread where Perel or someone like that put out, who's under 10K on Twitter and needs more attention. And everyone put up Brandon. And I was like, I need to check this guy out because literally every response to this thread is about Brandon. It's kind of funny. I re-listened to this conversation right before we're recording this, and we re-recorded it a few weeks back. And that was before Brandon had done some of the interviews that were coming together as we were recording this, which was really interesting to see how things have progressed even just in the 2 weeks separating us recording this conversation now and the initial podcast. But anyway, I think y'all will really enjoy hearing Brandon's thoughts on all these different topics. So I'm just gonna cut to the audio. What's up, Brandon? Thanks for coming on. We're excited to chat with you.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Absolutely. I want to start out by asking kind of for your backstory, a little bit of, you've been doing so much and what from the outside looks like it's just been a short couple of months. So you share kind of what the beginning point was. Kyle and I like to ask a lot about inflection points. What was that moment for you that kind of put you on the path you're on right now?
Yeah, I think for me, the inflection point was honestly seeing what COVID has done to what my previous plans were this summer. And so I graduated high school in 2020. So all of the previous plans to travel and everything like that obviously was canceled. So I was like, what can I do to kind of leverage this summer? And because I'm not going to be able to do what I originally planned, how can I do that? And one area of this was getting on Twitter. And I actually started writing a bit before that. I probably started writing around 4 to 5 months ago. Some of the very, very first posts I kind of deleted. They were pretty bad. And I wasn't really sure what I was writing about. But yeah, once I kind of discovered Twitter, and I feel like, I always reference COVID as this inflection point because it's almost like you're replacing some of the previous connections you had made, and you aren't able to see during quarantine with people that you met on Twitter over the internet, and be able to learn from them. And so for me, that was like seeing the quality of people on Twitter, seeing how you can actually create strong relationships with these different people was kind of the turning point for me, where I was like, okay, this is a really great resource I could tap into.
Yeah, absolutely. COVID represents to me a very clear wall as to before and after. And before you think you can predict the future, right? You think you know what's going to happen next, but it just demolished that assumption in me, at least, that you just don't know what's coming next. But during that time when, you realize that you have to figure out how to leverage it, you took some online courses, right, to kind of improve yourself. What did you take and how did they influence you?
Yeah, I guess chronologically, it kind of went I took Rite of Passage, which is a live course, and it's, I want to say 5 weeks long, probably. It's how they advertised. And basically I kind of I was like, this is very much the logical next step. And I discovered David through his podcast. Actually was my first kind of interaction with him and seeing his stuff out there. But then like I said, when I came onto Twitter 4 months ago, I was like, yeah, this guy, his insights are really profound. I read his guide on writing online. I'm like, he has a really unique angle. So I feel like this would be a good, almost accelerator program for me. And so in the middle of the 5 weeks, I had been podcasting probably consistently maybe for 2 or so weeks before that. But then I was able to get on an episode with Jack, who I had really looked up to, kind of in conjunction with David, almost like at similar kind of time periods. And after the conversation, Jack was just like, "Oh, here are two different courses I think you might enjoy. You should take them." And I took those almost like during rite of passage, because they're kind of shorter, they're asynchronous. One is called How to Visualize Value, which is about how you can design things. But to me, instead of it being super focused on design, what my bigger takeaway from that was how you can distill a really complex topic and show it really clearly. So that has helped me more in terms of like writing, or when I'm hosting someone on the show, like trying to get at what they're actually talking about. And so after taking those three courses, I think like I had a really good understanding of like how much I could produce and what kind of topics I want to produce in, not necessarily what other people might consider like a niche yet. I don't think I've kind of fully want to go like all in on one area. I feel like for me, like the podcast is very much an exploratory mechanism where it's just a way to talk with interesting people, and niching that down would be detrimental to kind of what the audience is looking for. And although it might lead to certain growth if I like maybe perhaps went all in on like startups or something, but it might not be what I truly want yet. So it's still very much early on for me. So the online course space, I feel like, is just so underrated. I feel like it's a bad rap in certain senses because of some of the courses out there that are solely kind of driven by kind of this idea behind making money and passive income and things like that. And some of those courses are legit and do have merit to them. But I think that there's a different kind of almost like characteristic to some of these other courses, which are focused on providing you strictly the skills um, to any sort of to like a very basic skill, right? So write a passage teaches you how to write, how to visualize value teaches you how to design. Like these are things you can apply everywhere, whereas I feel like some of the other courses are just so focused on one thing that they're kind of too limiting in a sense.
Yeah, and Perel's kind of redesigning the online course with rite of passage, or at least like reimagining what it can be. And it comes with this community, right, where you meet all these people. And I know you were talking about on your podcast with him how the breakout rooms, the one-on-one, really define that experience for you. And I think that is kind of what's missing in like college right now for me. Is I'm taking all these asynchronous online classes where there's no community participation, and it makes it difficult. So building that into these online courses, just making them more and more valuable. I think that like for you though, you're able to turn a lot of these courses directly into action by posting on Twitter, by making this podcast. So it seems that you've been doing the podcast a little bit before, but like just really, behavior change type of things where you continue to do it. And I know that when you started your podcast, you listed like 6 people who were dream guests of yours, like Austin Lieberman, James Clear, a couple others. And at this point, you've interviewed over half. I think it's 5 out of 6 people. Why those 6? Why were those the ones that you wanted to interview? And what was your strategy for getting to them and connecting with them?
Yeah, so I think for me, it wasn't kind of like the inception of my podcast. I think the first 3 or 4 episodes of my podcast was I talked with a lot of strictly like college students, because like my original vision was like, oh, like talking to college students would be really cool to give insights to younger students. But I realized like that's not kind of like what I enjoyed. Like some of the insights were really profound in a sense, but there's only so much like college students could talk about in a sense when they're so similar in that regard yet, where they haven't been able to have the time to branch out yet. And so kind of like when I was moving on to this next stage where I was like, who do I want that is really interesting to me? I kind of looked at these people and I thought like each of them I could see myself kind of in their path or like going down that route. And so each of them I had also like a decent level of interaction with before, like I'd been following their work before. And I think that's the key to running a good podcast, right? It's a lot easier for me to prepare for like a James Clear because I've read Atomic Habits like twice already. And so really like I feel like I'm going into a conversation with someone I already know. Whereas if it's someone like that you're not as familiar with, it's a lot harder to prep. But for me, like reaching out to these people, I think it was really just a product of really consistent output. I think most of my connections I make are through Twitter. And I think it's just like Twitter is so underrated because you're getting in front of the eyes of so many people. Like you might not be getting that many likes, but if you look into it and you kind of dig deep, like the amount of impressions you have is like really, really impressive. Like last month, I think I had like 2.4 million, which like I would never have expected at the start, right? Like, and because of that, like you also have to factor in that's like you probably get in front of some of these people's eyes like without really even like them thinking about you, but once you DM them again, you'll be familiar to them. You'll be like, oh, I've seen you before. And I feel like that's what I get from a lot of my guests. Like they're always like, oh, I've seen you pop up on Twitter before. What is your kind of deal and things like that? And they're curious about that. And I say this idea of like consistent iteration because like I think the reason we'll just use the James Clear example because I feel like it's probably like my biggest guest that I've had on. And I think like the product of me being able to ask him to come on the show was because I think he posted a tweet the around a month ago where it was like who is under 10K and deserves to be followed or is like underrated in a sense. And I got tagged a bunch of times. And I think that the only reason it was almost like I was at the right place at the right time. I'd probably been around a month or so of being on Twitter and I was posting pretty consistently and the content areas were pretty consistent. And so people were inclined because they're like, oh, this guy's already very consistent and his content is generally around the same stuff to tag me in the post. And so I think, and then he followed me. And then I decided to reach out because I was like, oh, I'm probably not going to get another shot at this. Like it's probably best to ride the wave of familiarity and there's a reason for me to contact him, right? Because he just followed me just to say like hello. And so I think like a lot of it is down to the timing, right? You have to be to take advantage of those moments where you get in front of someone. Like I had a friend, I think he writes for Trends. His name is Trung Fan. I think he just made a thread about like Elon Musk, right? And Elon began to comment on his stuff, commented on that thread and began to talk with him. And so yeah, it's just like, and then he went on to like have like not multiple, but like follow up, and they had like a longer form conversation, but just like going in and really saying like, oh, this is like the one chance I have of interacting with you. Let me make the most of it. And like don't underestimate like how like close I guess you are to making that connection, right? Because you're putting if you're putting content out there, like you're increasing the likelihood that people are familiar with you or are going to be impressed by what you're doing.
I think that thread. First of all, there's a lot of great value there to unpack. Maybe we'll get like an illustrator who'll visualize it for us. But I think that thread is where I found you in the first place. It might have been, I think Perel or someone may have copied that same idea. Like, here are some Twitter accounts under 10K that need more attention. And I saw you like 20, 40, 30 times on the same thread and was like, all right, I'm gonna check this guy out. And then, see your work, see your consistency, see it every time I go on Twitter. There's 1 or 2 or 3 of your tweets in the feed. It's like, okay. And then I start to see the work you're putting out. Okay, this kid who's not even in college yet just put on an interview with Perel. He just put an interview out with Pomp. Like, this is someone I want to talk to because he's doing a great job at all the things I'm wanting to be able to do right now. And so that's just such a clear illustration of the truth behind all of those things. I've recently been rereading The Third Door by Alex Bain, and there's this line in there that when it's in front of you, make your move. Alex is on the same mission, right? Do all these amazing interviews. And he had the good fortune, which we don't have right now, of being in Los Angeles, where you literally just happen to bump into celebrities semi-frequently. He's like, so sees Larry King in a grocery store. You can't not take advantage of that opportunity to talk to him, to ask him to another thing. You see Tony Hsieh at some party or a TED conference, and it's like, well, this is my one chance. I've had this book on my bookshelf for months. Like, I'm going to make this moment, and there's no reason you can't extrapolate that same principle to the digital world. And that's something you've done a great job at. And I think one way, kind of what you said there about serendipity, that a previous guest brought to my attention, his name's Ivan, is you find those people that you don't have to let those things be an accident, right? It doesn't have to be James Clear makes this post that you're the perfect Twitter size in that frame of mind to be brought up. You can put on post notifications for these people, and consistently every single time that they come up with something, like, do your best to say something interesting, and eventually they're going to notice you. And then when they notice you in a great light, that's when you really, strike up a conversation in a more direct way.
Yeah, I have a great example for that for Pomp. I initially asked him to come on the show probably around pretty early, and it was like two months ago almost. So like still season 1. I think I just finished my interview with Jack, and I was like just getting like more and more attention on the podcast then. And basically I asked him, and he agreed. He responded, and afterwards I was like, I tried to follow up 2 or 3 times, didn't respond, and then I was like, okay, maybe like this is not going to happen. But then unrelated, because this was like a month later, I put out a thread where I was just like, I went because right now Pomp tweets a lot about Bitcoin and things like that, but in 2018, 2019, he had a phase where he was like talking about like some of the characteristics of like the most successful people he's seen and been around. And I was just like, oh, this is pretty cool. So I went around and dug around his like 2018, 2019 tweets to look for stuff that wasn't necessarily related to like finance or money or Bitcoin. And I made a quick thread about that. And then he kind of like, he saw me again, I guess, through that thread. And he was just like, oh, he like followed up on DM. He was like, oh yeah, let's schedule a time for this interview. Like, are you free this week? And so I think another kind of follow up to that is a lot of these people, they're not ignoring you. They're just really, really busy. So it's totally okay if you reach out 2 to 3 times, but also not completely push the envelope. Never get mad. Never repeat anything. Try different calls to actions. Try different channels, perhaps, and try and just keep being very, very friendly and keep being yourself, because there's definitely ways that the advice I just gave could go wrong. But yeah, like getting in front of people is the most important part, like the frequency. And I think like adding on to the point you talked about, like being on David's thread, I think that was also like looping back to Rite of Passage was a product of being in that community. I think that what's important is that I think Rite of Passage showed me that you can actually make friends on Twitter, like people that you communicate with every day. I have one friend, Robbie Crabtree. You've probably seen him on Twitter.
Seen him a couple times, yeah.
Yeah. He's like a lawyer and a law professor. And after taking Rite of Passage, he was like, oh, I want to create like an equivalent, but for people that need to learn how to speak and communicate and tell story through language. And so kind of Robbie and I just kind of hit it off the bat. We're pretty close, and we decided to like every day, it's not every day now, but like Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, we get together in the morning and we write together. We get on a call, keep each other accountable. And if we have any questions or things we want to talk about, talk to each other. And there's a bunch of people I also mentioned, a couple sometimes join us for our writing group, but it just shows like, right, it's not, after Rite of Passage ended, like my connection with these people didn't end. And right, like the fact that you can like get on a call with someone, and I've never met Robbie before. I live in California, he lives in Texas. Like we've like never really talked about things outside of like this. We slowly are branching out, but like it's just like so interesting that you can like make friends this way. And I think like if you don't have like a deep rooted connection with someone, it's hard for them to, when they see that thread, you have to be the first person that comes to mind, right? You have to be number one in their head. So like I'd say it's like similar to the Patrick Collison advice, like do things that don't scale, like double down on people you find interesting and you think are cool, and go and make a deep connection with them instead of trying to have like mediocre connections with everyone in your following, because it's not as the reward is not going to be as great.
No, there are a lot of good ideas, and I think you really gave us some examples there of some examples of mindful productivity. Doing that weekly co-working call is a low friction way to consistently get a lot done, and is a low friction way to consistently be networking and continuing to maintain the important connections in your network that can lead to serendipity and other things like that. And so I want to transition now to unpack some ideas from your writing, because this was the assumption up until this point in the interview that your tweets were good. That if you're just tweeting something crappy every day, right, you're not going to get any attention. You're just going to be the guy who puts out 7,000 bad tweets. But you actually have a lot of really, really interesting ideas that you talk about in your writing. And I want to first start out with one I found recently on your website, which is the personal user manual. Can you explain what that concept is and the purpose of it?
Yeah, so I first, it's not my idea. First, I'd like to give credit to Steve Schlafman, who I had on the podcast a couple weeks ago. Steve is what he calls himself is a recovering VC. So he's not in VC anymore, but he is a angel investor and a coach. And so I think he really knows what he's talking about when it comes to mindfulness and working in teams. And basically, he did this exercise where he fills out basically a series of really introspective questions, but they're also, instead of like solely being focused on yourself, it's about kind of like how you work in a team or how you work with others. And it's just like really forces you to be honest with yourself about like, what scenarios am I good in? What do I look for in other people? What is it actually that I do that is better than everyone else? And so it's almost like been a replacement for a resume in some senses, where if you're just about to work on a new project with someone, or you're interested in learning more about them or working with them, sometimes you'll just forward it to whoever you're working with. I found it to be pretty useful, and I think that it's inspired a lot of people, especially people that aren't in like super traditional like corporate working settings, to do it, because it kind of gives you those guiding principles for how you operate, and it gives you like almost like a set of requirements for like who you're looking for. And so, yeah, like I said, Robbie did one. But yeah, the original idea was from Schlaf, and he worked with a good friend, Rishi Tripathi. He's now at On Deck, but I just thought that exercise looks so interesting.
We got another question for you about Rishi in a minute, but I love that. And it's been for people that especially maintain a public presence, like yourself or your podcast guests, or Kyle and I had Wes KO on, who worked with Seth Godin in the Alt MBA, and she had this pretty much the same concept on her website of a personal user manual. It's like, these are things that I get excited to talk about. These are things that are boring to me. These are things that annoy me. And we just looked through that and we're like, let's not ask about this. Let's ask about this. And she was in a great mood on the podcast because she told us what excites her to talk about, and we asked about it. And so it kind of really helps. There's nothing wrong with telling people how you prefer to work. And it's like amazing that if you actually do that and respect what people like, your relationship just is off to a great start. Kyle, you look like you had a question there. You want to go for it?
I was going to ask you what are some highlights from your personal user manual? Like, what gives you energy when you're working?
Yeah, I think for me, like the most powerful part of doing that was like really trying to think about like who I would want to work with. And I feel like that's almost a reflection of who I want to be to other people. And so I think that one area I need to get better at is, I realize I need to be better at communicating and responding quicker. I feel like especially with more kind of like serendipity and more opportunities, more people asking you to look at things or kind of communicate or get on a call, just really trying to be a better communicator. So I think like recently I've just been investing in like trying to really optimize and automate my system to make it really easy for me to take more calls, but also like not run out of space to like have long periods of time where I could focus. Because I feel like calls, like doing a long form call with you guys or a podcast is really interesting, but oftentimes I get like, oh, can we hop on a call for 15 minutes and talk about this? So like really trying to automate that and set up a strict system for that has been something that I think the personal user manual has helped me highlight. Like, I feel like the most powerful thing of writing something like that is not to just throw it out there, but to use it to like, oh, how can I change my life? So like automating things like Calendly, like keyboard shortcuts for responses, like everyone's telling you, right? Like there's the power to be more productive is in saying no, right? Everyone's saying like I think super organizers like Dan Shipper, they just put out a highlight on like Andrew Wilkinson. He's like the owner of the founder of Tiny, co-founder of Tiny, and he barely takes any meetings. He has a keyboard shortcut, an email shortcut for like 4 or 5 different responses that basically he can kind of like knock out any request that you have to talk to him. And because he just wants time to be able to work with the companies that he's investing in. And I think like realizing that has been really powerful for me. Some personal highlights about me, I'd say, I think recognizing that I was really coachable helped as well. I think that, right? I think a lot of people, it's interesting, right? Because when you're young, it's like kind of hard to find a balance between like, am I solely just curious, or do I need a mentor to help? Not necessarily need, but will I benefit from having a mentor to help me in this regard? Because sometimes it's better for us to or like college age students to do something on our own, right? Like the internet gives us like so many tools that we can probably do most things, but in some regards, some general aspects, like having a mentor can help. And I think recognizing that was important for me.
Yeah.
What was that, Kyle?
No, you go for it, Lewis.
I was just going to say, I completely think that's been one of my most valuable takeaways from doing this podcast, is kind of overcoming that idea that, I can do everything, because truly, like you said, with the internet, you can learn how to do anything super easily. And school, I think this is a very unproductive belief that we're taught in school, is that like learn how to do everything yourself. Like right now, I'm stressing about this computer science project on something in any other circumstance, I would have absolutely no problem paying someone to do for me. But that would be, academic dishonesty. Probably shouldn't do that. You probably shouldn't do that if you're in school. But again, that's not the best example, because I could just pay someone to do and learning it. But when it is something you want to learn, like, can you imagine had you just said, I'm going to be my own writing teacher, right? Like Benjamin Franklin, he came up with these exercises where he copied passages out of the journal and would rewrite them from scratch. Like, I'm just going to write my own protocol. Or I could have David Perel, who's crushing it right now, be on a one-on-one call with him a couple times a week, and his community. Like, you accelerate your learning so dramatically by surrounding yourself with the best in the world. And that was the exact framework of another one of our podcast guests. He's like, in your 20s, just find the best in the world at what you're doing and learn from them, whether you have to pay them or they pay you, but like minimum wage or it's free. It's like, there's no better way to get better at something than to have one-on-one instruction with the best person in the world. Another thing I wanted to ask about you, this idea from your blog as it relates to learning and specialization, is this idea of a niche from abundance and ikigai. If I'm saying that word correctly, if it's Japanese, I don't really know. I didn't pick up the language. But could you explain what that is and kind of how it relates to this discussion and what the thesis is? Because I really enjoyed that piece, but would love to hear you explain kind of the takeaways from it.
Yeah, so I think like this is very much a piece I wrote in the midst of Rite of Passage, because everyone was so concerned with what should I specialize in, what should my niche be. I want to grow, so I need kind of an area of specialization. And I feel like Rishi talked about this a lot on our podcast together, but ikigai is the Japanese term for the reason for being. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly either. There's a graph that's really famous about it. That's kind of like a 4-panel Venn diagram thing. That's more of a Western interpretation, but I like using it a lot because I feel like it gives you a lot of like questions that you can ask that are really introspective. And basically the key definition is it's kind of being like a intersection between like what you love doing in the first place, but also they call it what does the world need, but I don't think it's important to look at what the entire world needs. Like just look at like your 1,000 true fans or 100 true fans, like what is there some demand for? And then also like you should have like they call it like what you are good at, but I look at it more as like what you enjoy doing and what you are interested in. It doesn't have to be one thing. It can be a bunch of different things. And the last area is a little funny. It's just like, what can you be paid for? So again, that kind of attributes to what is their demand for? And I kind of looked at this and I was like, yeah, because there's so many different inputs to this, I feel like it's so misunderstood that a niche is small. A niche is not necessarily small, right? Like Costco has a niche, right? But Costco is huge. Costco's niche is that they sell everything in bulk for the cheapest price that you can get it for. But and this is in a book that ebook that recently came out from a good friend, Steph Smith. She leads the Hustle at Trends growth there, and she's an amazing writer. And she recently launched a book on Gumroad called Doing Content Right, and it's all about like, right, we're in the sea of information where I don't know the specific stats, but like 60 million domains were created in Q1 of 2020 or something like that. How can like, is it still worth it to start a blog? Is it still worth it to put content out there if it's just going to get lost? And basically what she was saying is like, when you're looking for a niche, like don't get scared because you're thinking it's so small, because even if you cut like such a small slice from that pie and you really become an expert in it, you can leverage it for so much more growth. Like she initially wrote about like remote work because she was like lived as a digital nomad in like 2015, so like 5 years before it became mainstream in 2020, right? And now everyone is reading her stuff, right? Because everyone wants to work, everyone is working remotely. So it's, I mean, obviously there's some level of chance and fate, and I guess in that sense, but the bigger lesson for me there was just like nothing is that small on the internet.
Yeah, there's definitely a blue ocean out there for anything that you might decide to go into. And I think starting is like the most important thing, right? I was listening to a podcast the other day. I think it was My First Million. That's another hustle brand, but they were talking about how much more valuable it would be for someone to start tweeting about breakdancing and be some authority among 5,000 people about breakdancing than it would be for them to
That's
not
going to
talk
be me,
about
by the way.
about their experience, and just like what that content creation can do for you at the end of the day. um, yeah, and to speak on the point about how much content's being created, I saw this stat. I think Lewis might have told it to me, but it's something like we read 90,000 words a day between, or the average person does, between like Instagram and Facebook and all these things that you're seeing and billboards. It's just like people are overcome with information, but if you can really put out quality content, people will, watch it and listen to you, and you will grow. But kind of shifting gears now, back to a point you made a little while earlier about your mentor and deciding kind of what that looked like. And the question is, how and why did you get an apprenticeship? And like, would you recommend that to anyone, or what situation would you not recommend someone get an apprenticeship?
Yeah.
Can you backpedal and kind of explain the structure of an apprenticeship, what that looks like in 2020? Because you're not becoming a blacksmith, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
No, not a blacksmith, but yeah, first I think like I'm a big fan of My First Million as well. I think one thing they do really well is they talk about stuff that's not like, I feel like is the startup world that is unrelated to or like it's not like the typical like super sexy like startups, right? It's not like it's your kind of Airbnbs, but it's like very interesting ideas that they bring up. So I just wanted to say that the stuff they're doing is really interesting. And I guess to talk a bit more about my apprenticeship, I don't know if Jack formally calls it this, but basically I pitched it to him to work at Visualize Value after I took those 2 courses, joined the community. I was like, there are some things I could do here that I think could help, and I think I have ideas to help them grow. And this was a perfect intersection because I was in the middle of rite of passage. We were in class, and the topic of the class was cold emails. And I know it's a little unfair for me because it wasn't really a cold email because I'd talked with Jack before, but kind of there's so many examples. Like when David was first coming up with the North Star podcast, when he was reaching out to Neil deGrasse Tyson of the Tyler Cowen. Sorry, I got those two kind of combined their names now. But when he was reaching out to these guys, it was just through a simple email. He played to the student role, kind of saying like, I'm a student, I'm really curious, I want to learn. And I was like, oh, I could do that too. But I already have a podcast, so maybe I should take that and see if I could work with this guy I really look up to. I think the central messaging of Visualize Value really resonated with me. It is kind of a focus on building independent income and mental wealth. And I think like that's so important now because of like the content overload we're seeing, kind of the just kind of like there's a lot of stuff out there that when you see that there's a ton of content out there that when you see is not really great for your mind. And so we're trying to say like we want to improve the quality of information and how fast we get it to you through Visualize Value. And so I cold emailed Jack. Previously it had only been conversations through Twitter DM. I highlighted a couple different points. I think that's the key to a cold email. It's a clear call to action right away. I just said, here, I want to work for you. But here's a couple ideas I have, right? I'm not just reaching out so I could leverage this brand and this idea, but I actually think there's some things we could change here. And some of those things didn't come through, but a lot of those changes have been made. I think some of the changes right now that have been kind of visual and that you can see is we're testing an affiliate kind of marketing program. We're not sure if we want to open it up, and even if we do, it'd be very kind of boutique and 2 to 3 affiliates every time. But another area is we're launching success stories, which is I've been able to talk with some of the people that have completed both courses, and they're launching really cool programs themselves, really cool products themselves, just learning about how visualized value changed their lives, and also just working within the community. So kind of operating on a level, writing the community mail drop. It's basically a community-based newsletter where we talk about some of the wins that members of the community had, some new projects that are launching, almost like a small premium version of like the Indie Hackers or Product Hunt newsletters. But yeah, it's been super rewarding so far. I think I would recommend to have this sort of like apprenticeship, if it's more of like a boutique kind of business that you can have a good relationship with. Like, I think the reason that it works between me and Jack is he really lets me like kind of do and pitch products to him because he trusts me to be able to execute on them. And it before, like, Visualized Value was also really small. It was just him and his wife, right? So like getting to know them and joining that smaller team, it allows a lot more flexibility for me. I wasn't operating like with multiple levels of bosses in like a big agency or anything like that. I think like really being able to build a sense of trust and have an understanding with who you're working with is the key to, if I would recommend having an apprenticeship or reaching out. But I've had a lot of people reach out to me who have, after reading the article about cold emails and stuff, have followed up and said like, oh, I've been able to reach out with some people I look up to and work with them. And I think that's really rewarding to see on my end. I think that there is definitely so much opportunity for stuff like this. Like, you don't have to work at a huge startup right away. You don't have to work at Goldman, or you don't have to go to like McKinsey. You can just like get some experience early doing really cool stuff on the internet. And also, like, when I first started, it was completely unpaid. I was like, I just want to do this because I'm really interested in the stuff you're doing. But now, as I kind of put more time and effort into it, it's become like a really close working relationship, doing a lot of growth stuff as well now. Trying to figure out how we can grow it apart from just Instagram and Twitter, which Jack is completely masterful at, great at social media, great at design. That is completely his forte, but just giving him small suggestions on what could help grow. And I think that's also something they appreciate, right? Because even though you might not be as experienced with them in some areas, you can leverage what you know. So I was like, I think that Visualized Value could really benefit from doing some more things on email, doing some email funnels, sure. Doing growth on things like Reddit or Indie Hackers. There's a huge
they'd crush Indie Hackers, dude.
Yeah, like if you're doing a case study on kind of your growth and really telling a story through your journey. So we've already been working on a couple drafts for that. So it's just been a really great experience.
That's great. And I have 2 comments to make here, then Kyle has a question. First of all, I completely agree with you about the rewards of doing the type of work that, the 3 of us are trying to do, putting out content and sharing ideas and interviewing people. Is that reward is someone takes, this is exactly what, David Perel said to you on his episode, is someone took your idea, ran with it, and something good happened to them as a result of it. So, you taught all these people about cold emailing. They did the same. They went out and cold emailed, and now they have these great opportunities, these great life-changing conversations. And for us, that's totally the same thing. And I just want to share with you that, seeing you as a peer to us, you're around the same age, you're doing the same kind of work, and seeing some of the success that you've been able to have has been super inspiring for Kyle and I, just to lift the bar for ourselves and say, Brandon's crushing it. We gotta step up our game, because this he's killing it. I've wanted to start a newsletter for months, maybe even years, and I still haven't gotten it fully set up yet, but it's I'm taking the first steps. I had an onboarding call with a rep at HubSpot to teach me the basics of it. And because seeing you crushing it and having 2,000 people on your list when I've been telling myself for months just to get it started. So I appreciate that. And then one comment here about something I know. You got to get a Redbubble account for Visualized Value, because some of the little designs, they would crush it on Redbubble. Kyle made some of them as lock screen for a couple of days, the one on compound interest. I would put that on my laptop, put it right here on my Yeti. If you could put those in little stickers, people would put those on stuff for sure. So that's just one idea.
I would definitely buy one. That the
Visualize Value sticker store would crush, dude.
exponential growth where it says this is pointless. That's my background right now. I love it.
I have the one that's it's like don't chase something, chase dopamine, don't chase dopamine or something like that. I have that one on.
But I wanted to make a comment too before I ask my question, just about it kind of ties together what you were saying earlier about a systemized way of thinking and doing things. Um, and a systemized way of thinking and doing things and making money, and how you don't have to work at Goldman, you don't have to work at McKinsey, but kind of that thought process can get broken. I was reading the Twitter thread by Nat Eliason the other day about systemizing your thinking, and one of his tweets in that thread was about how if you can go out and produce $4,000 or some number around there in 1 month, it really breaks a lot of that mental stress that you have, or you can that you can make things happen. You can rely on yourself, and I think that getting to that point is something that I really want to do in order for myself to be comfortable not needing to go out and get that job with McKinsey or that job at Goldman. Yeah, exactly.
Especially when all of your peers all day, that's all they talk about in accounting school.
Oh man, you wouldn't believe how many times I've heard the words EY at Deloitte in a sentence. It's horrible. But
today alone.
Well, not anymore, because
don't major in accounting, Brandon.
I don't have any classes.
Accounting is not a major in happiness.
But back to my question, I just wanted to ask this quickly about Jack and you guys' relationship. I know that you're learning a lot from him, but is there one lesson that you can distill out of that kind of changed the way that you look at the world over the last few months?
Yeah, just following up on Nat's Twitter thread, I think Nat is great. And I was on a call with him earlier this week, and it was so funny because we actually went to the same high school. We went to the same boarding school on the East Coast, which was just hilarious. And we just got talking about that. But yeah, following up on that question, I think like Nat and Jack both kind of mentioned this. I feel like Jack even breaks it down even more. He had one tweet that was just like, make like a challenge to make $1 online. Just make $1 online and your entire world review will change, right? I think my first dollars online was, I used to write for like the Medium Partner program. And I think one of my articles, I think it was actually highlighting one of Pomp's like growth, like some of Pomp's growth strategies. I think that one got like 20 or something thousand views or something. It was crazy. And I was like, damn, like there is potential for here. There's a thirst for content that is good and well curated. So I think that's one lesson from Jack that I kind of like, even scaling down from Nat's lesson. If you just get through that mental barrier, it is really powerful. And then I think it's also just his story of how he started Visualize Value is really interesting, right? Like he worked in kind of the agency world for so long and he created his own to try and go solo. But what he was realizing was that he couldn't really scale without also scaling like his time commitment and his effort. And that's not what he wanted kind of going into the future. And I think like, just like seeing that understanding from him early just also pushes you to know that like, oh, there's other parts to wealth than just solely the monetary value. There's like the time and the enjoyment as well. I mean, everyone's seen Naval's thread. It seems like a lot of people that are making kind of their independent income or passive income attribute some of the lessons to that. So if anyone, I feel like everyone should have seen it, but if anyone hasn't seen it, I would recommend reading that to get your start, I guess.
I cannot recommend more highly the Naval How to Get Rich Without Getting Lucky. I mean, I think it's something that should be reread. Kyle, you have a comment?
I was going to say, or listen to the podcast, because I really like the podcast as well.
We should just go back, and even on episodes where it's not mentioned, just put it in the show notes. Just like, in this interview, we mentioned the Naval How to Get Rich Without Getting Lucky. And people think we're smart because we put that in our show notes, and they're going to be like, I found that from Lewis and Kyle. It doesn't even matter if the guest doesn't bring it up, right? Just like, it's that good of a recommendation. And I actually found it from the newsletter of one of our previous guests, Thomas Lernovicius. And I was like, if Thomas is listening to this, I got to listen to this. And then, so that we'll put it in his show notes. That'll be our first place where we plant that seed. One question from you, also going from bring myself back on track. Another thing I really learned from one of our guests, Will Brown, is the idea of bottlenecks. So what is everything you've described, right, has been really great. You're like, this is going well. My Twitter's blowing up. I'm helping Jack. We're crushing it. We're building community. What are some struggles you're facing, or what are some the pain points or difficulties you've been encountering on all the work that you've been doing?
Yeah, I think it's mainly dealing with the people, not dealing with the people, but like trying to come to the conclusion that for the podcast, like it's not going to be super, super niche, right? Like, and trying to explain that to different people has been an interesting experience. But I would also say another, not necessarily pain point, but just trying to figure out the correct posting schedule or growth strategies for the podcast, like going forward. I think that right now I'm also like exploring how to do YouTube with the podcast, and I have a great editor that is a good friend that helps me with that. But just trying to see like what are some ways to improve the growth. Does that mean like doing more than one episode a week? Does that mean cutting up a bunch of different video clips with different timestamps and doing that? But just thinking about that has been very, very interesting, and it's been a conversation I've always been having. I feel like this past week I've also gotten on different calls with different people. I think I posted earlier this week about like I was having like kind of a contemplation of like, should I change the name of my show, or should I do this? And a bunch of people reached out and they were like, oh, we can help you with kind of your branding and positioning and things like that. And it's just been really interesting to like talk with these different people and see where to go from there. So yeah, I'd say like trying to think about the future of the podcast has been kind of like the biggest area of thought and effort these past couple of weeks.
Yeah, I think that Lewis and I have had probably the exact same conversation, probably the exact same number of times. You know, our podcast is just called The Lewis and Kyle Show, and we pretty much talk to whoever we find interesting whenever we find them interesting. So explaining that niche to different people that we get on the phone with has been a problem, for sure. But, you know, not having a niche is also a niche, and talking to interesting people is a niche. And I think a lot of the intrinsic value that we've gotten out of this podcast just from the conversations is like the conversations that we have with people that we wouldn't have if we had a niche have been so valuable that it's like, why would we box ourselves into some small corner of this population?
Real quick before you ask your next question, I had a comment I wanted to make. Just
it wasn't a question. I was going to say that I thought
you did your question. That was a different than.
I was going to say that student mindset. I think that you should change the name. I think that you'll. I think you'll appeal to a larger audience if you change the name. I was going to comment on your thing about a name to change it to, but I couldn't think of one. I didn't like either of the ones that you had suggested. So.
I think that
the planning stage of that one.
I think an interesting comment there, this is not what I was about to say, about the student mindset. So I was listening to a podcast today with Book Thinkers. He brought on Evan Carmichael, and they're going through some ideas about how Book Thinkers, which is, you know, this Instagram account for books, could create products about personal development. And the host of the podcast was like, what if I called it, you know, like 15 ways to grow 1% better every day? And he's like, the guest was like, that's a terrible idea, because you're trying to brand this. Your goal that you expressed to me is for beginners who aren't into personal development to read this as their guide. And you're going to scare all of them away with a title like that. So whereas, you know, my idea with your title of the student mindset is where, you know, Kyle and I, who are deep in like the personal development space, obviously are going to get like, oh, you know, it's not college student forever. It's always a learner, lifelong learner. Like there's always something people can teach me. And that makes a lot of sense. Whereas, you know, some random person who's not as deep in the space yet might be like college student podcast, college student graduation, like I'm not 20 anymore. So I think that might make some sense, but it's just again, the purpose and the direction for it. But the comment I was going to make, Kyle, and this is something I wanted to mention earlier, when you were bringing up, Brandon, the point about, I'm forgetting the name of the person who made the idea, the person from The Hustle, what was her name? Steph Smith?
Steph Smith, yeah.
Yeah, so when Steph had talked about, or you had talked about how, you know, you don't need to have this groundbreaking niche. It doesn't have to be totally interesting. Like she can talk about digital nomadism in 2020 and still get attention if she makes good work and brings a new angle to it. And I think one thing Kyle and I should lean into that we haven't is like, you know, people are like, what's the point of your podcast? And it's really, in my opinion, no different than Tim Ferriss show, except from the perspective of 20-year-olds who aren't successful yet. And I think we've kind of run away from just like that copy paste branding of like, this is the Tim Ferriss show. We want to unpack high performers in all the fields we're interested in, whether that's business, whether that's fitness, whether that's health, whether that's writing, right? Just unpack high performers, or Twitter, right? People who are crushing on Twitter, unpack anyone who's doing a great job with something we want to do, ask them habits and routines, right? Like stealing all of Tim's messaging, all of his purpose, but we're 20-year-old hosts who haven't achieved that level of success yet, who don't have that audience. And we're kind of more in the learn and apply role. And I think we've kind of been afraid to just say that's what we're out here to do, when I think it perfectly describes what we're out here to do. And I think there's nothing wrong with just borrowing that niche, but the fact that we're bringing a different perspective to it of being 20 years old and not successful yet is the niche in and of itself. So I appreciate you making that Steph Smith comment earlier, because that really kind of got me on that train of thought.
No, she's great. I would recommend getting her stuff. I think, not even just her book, but she has a couple really great like long form essays. Her most famous one, I think it might have been like passed around, but it's called How to Be Great, Just Be Good Repeatedly. It went super viral a couple of years ago, but yeah, some of her stuff is amazing.
Fantastic. I'll have to check it out. And the story, I mean, I don't need to get too into Steph Smith here, of how she sold that book's pretty cool too. She just like put out a feeler on Twitter, like, if I wrote a book about X, would people be interested? And it got like a couple hundred likes and a couple dozen retweets. And she's like, well, if it's $100 product and that's 12 buyers, that's $1,000, and it's going to take me 10 hours to write. That's a positive trade-off. So I'm gonna do it.
I think
so that's a cool story on its own right.
I think Derek Sievers did the exact same thing on his Twitter. He was like, if I compiled all my blog posts and sold it as a book, would you buy it? And a bunch of people said, of course I would. And so he did it, and now it's for sale, and he's probably making tons of money off of it.
Definitely is. And Nat Eliason just sells his book notes and makes a ton of money with that. Yeah.
But I don't know if you read.
I think we're about to say the same thing, but you can do it.
I don't know if you read his blog post about making a blog, but his graph about his revenue will blow your mind from the beginning of quarantine to now with the Rome course. It's crazy how much money he's able to generate off of Rome and the course that he created. I'm sure it's, joining Forte Labs, it's only going to go way up from there. Like,
you want to move now to the bonus questions, Kyle?
Let's do it. Absolutely.
So first question we have for you, this is something you probably get asked a lot, so I apologize we never want to be the repeat question guys, but I haven't heard your answer. So someone like you working with all these people who are literally like, their brand is, here's how you can learn how to make your own money off the internet so you don't have to go on the conventional path. So why are you still in school right now? Or what's your thinking there? What's your mind at with college?
Yeah, I think I've gotten asked this every single conversation I have, but I think so it's good, right? Because my answer will be hopefully decently rehearsed and decently explained. But for me, I think, right, it's like I said, it's still very much in the searching phase, and I feel like that's perfectly okay for someone, right, who hasn't had their first year of college, right? Some people just know kind of what they want to do early. But yeah, for me, it's very much, I feel like I made this decision because I recognize I could do both and balance both, and I see merits to both, right? I think I can still do the podcast newsletter and work with Jack, and that's kind of like helping me grow my audience, helping me look at these different tracks. And I could still go to school where I still have some areas that I personally am really interested in history, so I really want to still learn that and look at that. And I think that probably Columbia has some of the best teachers and courses for that. And so that's really rewarding to me in terms of kind of what I'm looking at just from a personal interest perspective. And I think that will only help me become a better host, better writer. I think that it's just the perfect balance for me, pretty much is how I've been explaining it to people. I think that, like, obviously everyone is trying to take a positive outlook on what's happened with COVID. And I honestly think that going to school remotely has been helpful, because not that I don't want to, but because I can't socialize as much, right? I have time to talk with these people on the internet instead. So that's my explanation.
I'm excited to see how your answer to that question changes over time, because I think that I think the frequency and intensity with which you're asked will only increase as you go through college and as your podcast and as your Twitter and all these things grow. But yeah, I think college is really a great time. Being at college is a lot different, and being around people is a lot different. So I have a different experience. But on to our next question. We're stealing this directly from Peter Thiel and the book 0 to 1. I'm sure that you've heard of it before, and if you're listening, you've heard of it. But what important truth do very few people agree with you on? So what do you believe that other people don't really believe?
Yeah, it's overrated.
I think that one area that Jack and I recently have been talking about, because he's launching Value app. It's kind of the @value tag on Twitter, and it's really focused on giving people information. Like the one thing is that, right, the entire concept of mental wealth is kind of counterintuitive with where visualized value is based, right? Because if we're talking about mental wealth, like we should probably not be using Twitter and Instagram and these very addictive social media platforms to get your attention, right? So that's the idea of Value app, to have some long form content in a very streamlined place where you're not going to get distracted by Twitter. And one of the conversations we were having about that is like, what kind of areas do we want to cover with those posts, and what are some of the things that, so this fundamental truths that some people might disagree with. And one of the things is that I feel like people are so stooped in negativity about where our world is headed and where our world is what it looks like, that they don't look at what it's become and what has grown and changed. I think it's that typical argument of, right, like if you, like, by all metrics, everything has been improving since whatever kind of date you try and measure from. Obviously there's dips and divots, and 2020 will rule as an anomaly in that sense, but
let's hope.
Look at it. There's this book that I can't come to name right now, but
is it Factfulness?
No, it's another one. I can forward it to you guys later. You guys can put it in the show notes, but it's basically all around this idea that basically it's not as doomed as everything seems. I feel like everyone that's been everyone's top of mind so far, and then it is. I mean, I'm not saying like climate change doesn't exist or anything like that, but I'm just saying like there's the negativity in society right now currently outweighs the positivity that should be there. I'm not saying that the positivity might override the negativity, like in terms of the ratio that it stands, but I feel like it's heavily underrated at this current moment.
Well, I think I'm going to try and kind of tie that together with what you said before. But like, I watched The Social Dilemma, shout out to Netflix, and it's all about how each person is kind of put into a box, and they're given facts to make them look at the world. And the more attention you give to one thing, the more attention or the bigger in your head that thing will be. And like, if you're on Twitter and you're looking at things that are negative, it's going to show you more things that are negative. And it's a lot easier to digest, or more interesting to digest that stuff, I think. And you just get rolling down this hill. And that's kind of the same thing about, how social media, you don't want to be looping people into social media to give them all this value on visualized value. I said I was going to try, and I think I'm failing.
I'll hop in here.
Yeah, go for it, Lewis.
So I think one thing that I found very interesting about what you're about to say with the visualized value, Brandon, about how, do we want to be putting this on Twitter? I think there's nothing wrong with, if people are going to be on people are going to be on this tool, right? Like, unless your message is, I'm going to get people off of Twitter, I think there's nothing wrong with trying to be that person that's like putting the needle in the haystack that catches someone's attention. Like, they find the visualized value tweet and they're like, oh shit, I was wasting time to go do something better. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with doubling down your Twitter strategy and putting more and more content on there and being like, this is a good idea in the sea of chaos. And I could rant for a long time, Kyle, about the things Brandon was just talking about. I 1,000% agree with you, right? Obviously, I'm going to say this comes from a point of ridiculous privilege to say how strongly I agree with you. And climate change is a very real problem, and there's a lot of not so good things on in the world. But I think it's one of the most powerful and important and underrated concepts right now is just stopping from a micro scale, right? Looking around at your personal situation and saying, wow, things are actually pretty fucking good, right? I mean, like if you read just one history book, if you read even just one historical fiction book and you're like, wow, 300 years ago, people didn't have fucking toothpaste, right? Like my personal moment right now is pretty good. I get to wake up, I'm in a comfortable bed. I don't have to worry about foraging for food. I don't have to worry about like all of these very challenging things. Like if something bad happens to me medically, if I got an ear infection, if I got a toothache, all of these things that used to like destroy your existence are fixed. So that's like a micro scale, right? Like you go to the grocery store, any craving you possibly have could be gratified in a 10-minute Target run. Any physical item you need for anything you probably want can be gratified by a 2 to 3 day purchase on Amazon. It's like, it's a quarantine. I want to learn this new hobby. I'm going to get whatever the heck I need, all this new equipment for this super niche thing I didn't even know about a week ago, delivered to my front door. And that's a level of access that most people listening to this podcast probably have. And just appreciating like those very small in the moment levels of gratitude is hugely important. And then on the macro scale, right, it's the Factfulness by Hans Rosling, Bill Gates, saves the world kind of thing, real life superhero. Like, let's look at infant mortality over the past 100 years. Let's look at polio and all these other terrible diseases that used to like literally destroy hundreds of thousands of people's lives every single year that just aren't problems anymore. And I think that's a huge problem with mainstream media and like the information that people consume is it doesn't put any attention into promoting these things. And this is why a lot of the time I'm the not social media guy, because most people aren't going to have these tools aren't built for you to curate your feed in a way that benefits you, right? The incentive of all of these tools is how do I get this person to spend the most amount of time on it? And positive energy, motivation to go do important things that aren't this is not going to keep you on the platform. It's controversy. It's comparing yourself to others. It's these moments that are going to draw you into a rabbit hole and ruin your day. Which is why, again, to repeat my ideas just a second ago, having visualized value in other accounts that are like, wait, here's a nugget of gold in the sea of trash. Like, go do something else. Go read this long form blog post, I think are a good thing. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to the question no one asked me that I just wanted to get off my chest that, maybe things aren't as bad as we think they are. And I could go on this for a long time, but next question.
Summation of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I'm with you. I passionately agree with you. So if I was the whole world, your answer wouldn't count for the Peter Thiel question because then the whole world would agree with you, but I'm not. So I was happy to tag team there. On the same note, I want to ask you a question about dopamine detoxes. So maybe you agree with what I just said and you're like, wow, these tools' best interest is for me to not have a good day. That's shitty. What's a dopamine detox? And what's your experience with it?
I try and do one once a month or so. I think that it's basically 1 day or a third of a day or half a day or however long you can dedicate to it, where you just focus on, you put everything away, and it's depending on the level of intensity. I think the very basics that you need to put away is obviously all your screens, all your TV, all your notifications, everything securely physically put away. And then focusing instead of on different tasks that you want to work on, or a lot of it is focused on just spending time in the moment. I feel like for me, the best part of doing it is going on a walk or writing on a journal. And I think that a lot of people really go to extremes where they're like, you're not allowed to read, you're not allowed to do this, do that. And I think that doesn't work for me. It works for other people in terms of like, just, they talk about like how like powerful the clarity is for them if they like truly don't do anything. But for me, I just end up feeling like I'm just sitting there and nothing's really happening. But the idea behind it is that it shows your body and your mind that there's just this one full stop where you can be like, oh, I can operate without these things. And just by doing that, I try and do it like once a month or so. But just by doing that once, like you're kind of constantly reminded, like in the future when you kind of feel that urge, that like you don't need it. So it's almost like giving you the weaponry to like be able to reduce your screen time normally as well and be able to say no to those type of things. So that's kind of how I would describe it. It's a very broad term, so I'm sure a lot of people have different takes, but that's kind of my experience with it and how I go about doing it.
I love that. And I think it's hugely important. And this is an idea I've written out in a blog post I wrote like 2 years ago when I was living in Israel, is like, what can we learn from like ancient religions? And the Jews, which I'm a Jew, so when I say the Jews, I'm including myself there, have the idea of Shabbat, which is a weekly dopamine detox. And it's like, wow, good things happen when we routinely put all of the distracting impulses that are new to society away from us and let ourselves just like focus on things in the moment. And no, you don't have to like eat. Just, I've heard people either fast on a dopamine detox and do like a dopamine detox and like a input detox, and also just, or they're like, no, I'm just gonna eat like unseasoned chicken because that would boost my dopamine if I had salt and pepper on it. So I think you have a good approach there. Kyle, you want to ask the next question?
Yeah, for sure. So, you've accomplished a ton in the last 7 months since COVID began, all of which you probably wouldn't have been able to predict beforehand. So I know this is a hard question to answer, but what are your 5-year goals from 5 years from now? What do you want to be doing and have accomplished?
I think the goal for me in 5 years is definitely to still have the podcast going, and to have it at some sort of scale by then where it's really being able to get to a lot of people. Because I think at the end it's all about presenting these new and cool opportunities that I was only able to find on Twitter to everyone to see, right? Like basically kind of that whole 4-hour work week like revolution where people were like, oh damn, like this is possible. Getting that story out there more. Another 5-year goal is, I think, right, because 5 years is smartly taken because it'd be after I'm done with college, right? So I had to pick something I'm doing by then. But I get this question a lot, and I think that for me it'd be at least testing the waters myself with trying to see like, oh, like what would working for myself look like, but also continue to expand and to add to the different mentors that I have, because I feel like that is important, right? And I feel like as you grow, right, you can have different mentors for different areas that you want to specialize in. So those are 2 other goals I would add. Yeah, I think those 2 are pretty solid.
I think that's great. And for a timestamp, how many Twitter followers do you think you'll have in 5 years?
5 years.
Uh-huh.
Who knows what Twitter will look like then, but
Assign a number. You got to say it.
I'd say 100K,
Okay.
150.
Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say, Kyle, along the same lines of questions. Part of the reason, Brandon, obviously, in the past 7 months, you've accomplished more than enough for us to like think you're a great guest for the show. But I think one of the most exciting things for Kyle and I about bringing someone like you on at this point in your life is like 5 years from now, when you are at that 150K followers and you've graduated Columbia or dropped out or whatever the heck you're going to do, and you have your own online course or your email list, isn't 2,000, it's 200,000 or something crazy like that. And it's like, I don't know if it's the first, but it's like among the first interviews where you came on, and it's going to be like, I have this vision, like you see those videos. This is getting way too romanticized here, but you see that video of like Bill Gates jumping over a table on like some like MSNBC interview. It's like, look at me, I'm Bill Gates, I'm 20, I'm an entrepreneur, and I can jump really high. And it's like, I feel like when Kyle and I bring on young people like yourselves, and we're young people as well, that we really think we're betting on, by bringing you on and saying this is someone we know that 5-10 years out from now is going to be doing super interesting stuff, and like to be that historic record of like where they were at this point in their life is super, super cool. So question for you, just the signing off question. If people enjoyed some of the ideas you shared with us in this conversation and want to learn more from your brain, where can they find you? Obviously Twitter, but where should we send people if they're interested in all the messaging you're putting out?
Yeah, my DMs are always open on Twitter. So if you have any questions there, reach out there. My podcast my podcast and my newsletter are kind of like the other 2 main mechanisms, and they're linked in my Twitter profile. So if you go look there, you can find all my details.
What if you're someone like me who, for most of my life, up until recently, didn't have Twitter? How can they find you that way?
They can just find me at my website, just my name, and super simple to find.
Okay, brandonzhang.com. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for coming on with us. We really appreciate this, and this was fun.
It was super fun on my end too, so I'm looking forward to hearing it.
And that wraps up our interview with Brandon. It was a really good conversation. Just a couple takeaways from me. One of which is just that it was really good to hear someone come to the same conclusion about finding his niche. He doesn't want to niche down too far because he is really interested in a lot of things, and he doesn't want to box himself in. I feel like we're kind of in that same boat. The next of which is apprenticeship. He's gotten a lot of value out of working with Jack at Visualize Value. And it's interesting. I wrote like, it's a new way of learning, but really it's the oldest way of learning. So it's interesting to see that come back, and it'll be great to see how he moves forward with that with Jack. And then the last of which is so obvious to us through so many of our interviews, is just the power of Twitter and what it can do for you. And yet it's not fully taken advantage of by us, or really by many people at all. It takes hard work, but it can produce some amazing results. What do you think, Lewis?
Yeah, I also came up with a list of 3 takeaways, some similar to yours, a couple a little different. First one, it's not too late to do content if you're going to do it right. And if you have an interesting take, again, you don't have to have a completely original idea. If you're providing a new perspective or a better angle on something that's already popular, that is a form of value creation, and that is probably worth your time and can blow doing. Brandon said, he had a Medium article about Pomp where he just talked about Pomp's best ideas and it got like 20,000 views. So, there's always opportunities for interesting content. Second is the power of making friends on the internet. I think, he talked about a lot of the benefits he's seen from masterminding and just co-working with random people he met from Twitter or Rite of Passage, and continuing relationships with people he's literally never met in person. And just before you and I are doing this conversation now, I had a chat with someone who I've made friends with just from a Facebook group that we both belonged in, with like an Alex Benayan fan club group. And it's like, we've had a couple conversations now, and he and I are sharing ideas and improving each other's projects just because we've made friends over the internet. Third one here is, this one's the common one I've said a lot of times throughout many episodes, is how mentors and paying for a coach or paying for the right resources can accelerate your progress. I think, Brandon's a super smart guy, but obviously a huge amount of his, but he's clearly been accelerated his progress even more dramatically because he invested in himself in these great resources and these great coaches and these great tools. And that's allowed him to reach a higher form of expression or a higher level of strategy and effectiveness much more quickly, and a community behind him that's really amplifying all of his efforts. So those are my takeaways from this conversation. I like to leave you all with a call to action if I can think of one. Pretty easy one from this conversation, 2 actually. First one is a personal user manual. I think that's an interesting exercise everyone could try for themselves. Brandon has a really good example of that on his website, brandonzhang.com. Not sure if that's how you say it, but it's phonetic, so that'll help you find it easier. Second one is to make your first $1 online. That's a cool challenge, and the mental landscape or how that changes the way you think about the world and the way you think about, making money and value creation. If you can just make $1 on the internet, sell a design on a website, or write an article, or get paid through the Medium Partner Program, it's just, once you feel even just a small sense of possibility, it changes the way you look at things. So 2 challenges, 2 calls to action for those interested in taking them. But that's all for this episode. Again, if it's your first time listening, there's a couple of ways for you to help us out or to support the show or to keep up with us. We have a newsletter. You can go to our website, lewisandkyle.com. There's opt-in forms throughout the website if you want to get updates about what we're doing to your inbox, just like I clearly got an email because the notification went off twice in this little dialogue. Otherwise, we also have social media accounts where we post updates about what we're doing, talk about the show, post sound bites, post fun clips. You can find us at Lewis Kyle Show on all major platforms. If you want to help us grow, the 2 most impactful ways for you to do that: first of all, leaving a rating or review on iTunes and subscribing. Second of all is just good old word of mouth. Tell someone about the show. If you liked it, share the link, let them know what we're doing and why they should listen. That's all for this week, guys. Thanks for listening. See ya.